Okay, so I kind of realized that you guys truly do love the idea of me covering a lot of like 1990s Marvel comics, or really 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Now, here's the thing. I don't really want to just cover just only the old stuff, like the old stuff, because for me personally, there's still good stories out there in the 2000s and 2010s. And heck, there are some good stories out there right now in the present day of comics. It's rare, but there's still some good stories out there. So I kind of want to sit down and continue to cover all different eras of different heroes when it comes to Marvel, DC, or even other comic book companies out there as well. Now, the reason why I'm saying all this for because you guys have been loving the idea of me covering different 1990s Marvel content on my channel. And honestly, I kind of love the 1990s as well. Now, not completely because I'm really more of an honest person. I don't want to say like, oh, the 1990s, everything was great. It's the only thing good about Marvel comics. No, because there were some things in the 1990s that weren't that great, really. We have to be honest. But for me personally, Spider-Man, X-Men were like the top two, right? But then after that, you had the tier two group. You had Ghost Rider, Punisher, Venom, all those anti-heroes. And really, the rest of Marvel kind of fell into the tier three group. Now, for me personally, I have to say that Steve Rogers was kind of riding that line in tier three to tier two. And the reason why, because for me personally, most of his stories in the 1990s were great. Now, I cannot say the same thing for some other properties in the 1990s, like, Avengers or Iron Man or even Thor. For me, they were just okay. But for Steve Rogers, they were amazing. And for me, they had some funny stories as well, but they were still really good. And so I kind of want to go ahead and continue our coverage over the 1990s Captain America. Because you guys loved Streets of Poison. You guys also loved The Trial of Diamondback as well. Now, those two stories, I actually read them from an epic collection called Captain America Streets of Poison. Go buy that epic collection. But either way, that epic collection did have some other stories as well that we can cover, like today's video. The whole idea of Steve Rogers teaming up with somebody who has not been seen in a very long time. Now, guys, real quickly, I thought when I saw this cover, it was Steve Rogers teaming up with Iceman. And honestly, I was really hyped to read this book, but to also cover the book as well. Like, hey guys, we got a Captain America and an Iceman crossover. Telling you right now, it's not Iceman, it's somebody else completely. And honestly, you really can't guess who it is until we get to that character's appearance. Now, letting you know that this is going to be like a one-shot story arc, only one single issue, and that's really it. But honestly, it's still a pretty strong issue for me that came out in the 1990s. Now, with that being said, this also kind of continues the whole storyline of Steve Rogers kind of wondering if he's still a super soldier. Let me explain. You see, back in Streets of Poison, unfortunately, Steve Rogers was hooked on drugs. Now, thanks to Hank Pym, he was kind of able to give Steve Rogers a blood transfusion. Now, with that blood transfusion, it was supposed to get rid of the drugs in his system, but also the possibility of getting rid of the super soldier serum as well. And so as we dive into the opening pages of today's storyline, we pick up with Steve Rogers kind of going through some tests given to him by Dr. Kincaid. Now, Dr. Kincaid is trying to see if Steve Rogers can still be a hero. And what I mean by that statement is that with the idea of Steve Rogers kind of losing the super soldier serum, can he still be out there as Captain America? But here comes the big catch. He can. And here's the reason why, because you have Steve realize that even though he has supposedly had lost the super soldier serum, technically he has not. You see, you have Dr. Kincaid say, well, technically the serum was not a drug, more like a virus that stayed in your system and it kept being able to clone itself and spread across your entire body. And so even though you did get a blood transfusion and it did pull out the supposed virus, if any cells were left behind, those cells were able to clone themselves and continue to grow in your body, allowing you to be Captain America still. Now, this kind of leads into the doctor asking Steve Rogers some more medical questions like, hey, Steve, do you have any allergies? No? Okay, cool. That's great. Hey, Steve, question. Did you have any major surgeries in the past? No? Okay, cool. Well, you know what? One last question. How are you when it comes to cold weather or coldness affecting your body? Now, this kind of leads into a whole retelling of the whole idea of Steve Rogers, fighting back in World War II, but unfortunately, he was frozen in time until you had the Avengers being able to find him and turning him into an Avenger. Now, the reason why it's being brought up right now because it's Steve Rogers kind of realizing that he had another friend out there that he has not seen in a very long time. You see, this story is kind of picking up where a different story had left off at back in issue number 349. And let me explain. In that storyline, you have Steve Rogers in the Demolition Man, better known as D-Man, fight against a certain group of people in the Arctic Circle. The problem is that as the battle went on, Steve Rogers had officially lost D-Man. Now he thought D-Man had fell into the cold waters. And so for Steve, he hated the idea of seeing a friend go through the same thing he did. He was kind of hoping to find D-Man and save his life. But the problem was that as he tried to look for D-Man, unfortunately, he was never able to find D-Man in the waters. But while you have Steve Rogers talking to the doctor about him losing D-Man, you didn't have him be confronted by Peggy Carter. Now, around this time in Marvel Comics, they had this crazy thing where you had the Avengers support team. Now, you would think like, okay, cool, the support team, like maybe some backup heroes. No, they were different regular humans who were just there to do different small tasks for the Avengers, like Peggy Carter. And right now, she's telling Steve Rogers that she had just found a newspaper talking about somebody finding a huge block of ice. And of course, somebody being frozen in that block of ice. And so for Steve Rogers, he is believing that most likely that's D-Man in that block of ice, his lost partner. Now, this is a man who's basically on a mission. He's trying to figure out if that person inside that block of ice could most likely be, D-Man. And so he flies over to the Arctic Circle. Now, when he does arrive, you do have some Eskimos lead him over to that block of ice. Now, when they do, you have Steve Rogers wanting to know if they know who could be inside that block of ice. Unfortunately, they have no idea. But on top of that, there is a language barrier as well. Now, that barrier is really important. And the reason why, because you have Steve Rogers being that hothead. He believes that D-Man is inside that block of ice. And so he tried to use his shield as a way to break the ice. But while doing that, you have one of the Eskimos begin to freak out like, if you break the ice, you are going to release the demon. Now, that demon is really more of an ice worm, a giant ice worm. So for Steve Rogers, he kind of realized that he just made a huge mistake. But either way, he now has no choice. He has to go out of his way to fight against this ice worm. The problem is, though, this ice worm is just way too strong for Steve Rogers to handle on his own. He's not really able to match this ice giant worm. And so once you have the worm being able to eat Steve Rogers, it does kind of seem like he's going to die here at the end of this storyline. But then at the very last second, somebody was able to save his life. Now, this was the moment where I thought, okay, y'all, We're gonna see Steve Rogers teaming up with Iceman, right? No, it's not. It's not Iceman at all. It's a character known as Jack Frost. Now, Jack Frost first appeared in USA Comics issue number 1 all the way back in 1941. Now, technically, he was part of a team called the Liberty Legion that was kind of put together by Bucky. Now, just like Steve Rogers, this guy right here had also disappeared in the 1940s to only reappear now in the 1990s. And we do learn what exactly happened to him. So what happened was he went back over to the Arctic Circle, hoping to figure out what was his actual origin, because back then he had no idea what his origin was. And matter of fact, right now, he still has no clue what his origin is. But you had Jack Frost run into the ice worm, where the ice worm, of course, ate him back then. Now, while inside the body of the ice worm, he realized the only way to defeat the worm was to freeze it from the inside out. And so when he did that, unfortunately, he also got frozen in that block of ice until you had Steve Rogers being able to, well, break him free. Now, for me personally, I kind of hate the idea of reintroducing a character that has been gone for like 45 years and then put the same character back on the back burner once again to possibly use that character in a later storyline, because this is how the ending goes for this storyline. You have Steve Rogers and also Jack Frost work together to fight against, well, the ice worm giant. But while you have our two heroes trying their best to fight against the worm, Jack Frost realized that the only way to actually defeat the worm is to do what he did many years ago, which is go inside the worm, use his ice powers as a way to freeze the worm from the inside out. But unfortunately, that means he might get stuck inside the worm as well, which he does. And then you have the two of them fall back into the Arctic waters. Now, for Steve Rogers, he begins to panic because that means he had once again lost, well, Jack Frost. And so to close on his book, you do have Thor appear. Now, technically earlier, I forgot to mention this. You had Steve Rogers call Thor for help. The problem was Thor was busy. But once Thor does arrive, he's kind of like, hey, listen, I was not able to find anything at all. But we also kind of get a small hint on the origin of Jack Frost here, where we do learn the possibility that Jack Frost is an ice giant who just was dwarf in his size. And so, unfortunately, he was then sent down to Earth. And that was really it. Honestly, we never gotten the full origin of Jack Frost. And so right now we're kind of left to believe in the possibility that Jack Frost was an ice giant who just came out small for his size. But with that being said, oh wait, no, there's one last thing. While you have Thor and Steve Rogers leave, you do have the book show us that D-Man was nearby, but apparently he was able to break free from his block of ice. But we have no idea where in the world is he. But now we can go ahead and end today's comic book video. So please leave me a like down below and subscribe. But guys, I'll see y'all next time. Later.